Good morning and welcome to the front room at the Queen Elizabeth Hall at Southbank Centre and day 3 of the Africa Utopia Festival. I'm Tamsin Oates and I'm Head of Festival Programme here at Southbank, and I work very closely with lots of amazing programmers to pull together our festivals, not least Hannah Poole, who's been working tirelessly on the Talks and Debates programme for Africa Utopia. Now, we've been realising that the start of a day is people start coming in bit by bit, so it will fill up as the talk goes on. But can I just let you know that if you are here also for the Africa Gathering programme, is there anyone here for Africa Gathering? There's a few people. Their talk is starting at 10:30 over in the Blue Room. And the Blue Room is a space underneath the ballroom over in the festival hall. So please do go over there at 10:30 for that talk, and that talk is called Africa Will Feed the World, and that's with Africa Gathering, so do go over there, and then come back and join us for the rest of the day, and then their final talk is at 4 p.m. over in the Blue Room, which is the other side of the Ebola story. So there's 2 Africa Gathering talks today. Please make sure you go along to those, but then come back and spend the day here taking part in all the other talks and debates in our programme. Just to let you know that Africa Utopia goes on till tomorrow. We have lots of amazing arts events happening across the site. There's a fashion show at 3 p.m. today. We've got a social dance looking at Angolan dance styles at 5 p.m. We've got Gina Yashiri doing a comedy night tonight in the Queen Elizabeth Hall. We've got Malatu, Ethiopian jazz musician, over in the festival hall. Tomorrow we've got North African breakdancers, and then we close the festival with the Kinshasa Symphony Orchestra. So there's lots to do, lots to take part in. Please go to the marketplace, enjoy the food stalls, and I will now hand over to Hannah Poole to talk about today's programme. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamsin, and thank you again for coming out to this first session. A lot of what's happening with Africa Utopia involves collaborations with various other organisations. Africa Gathering, as Tamsin said, the Rolake Society have also got a screening room in the Persal room all day, which is just across there. The fashion show has been collaborated. We have Kwani magazine, East African magazine, doing a zine making workshop throughout the day. We also have, as Tamsin said, the fashion show, panels on music, art and social change. Edna Adan, who I know is already here, is going to be doing a fabulous keynote here in this space at 11:30. But first off, we have the next panel, which is looking at Africa Rising and the whole narrative of Africa Rising and whether or not it's hype or reality. This panel is one of several that is also in collaboration with Africa Gathering, and the very fabulous Mariéme Jamme, who is founder of Africa Gathering, has helped me put together this and some of the other panels. So I'm going to hand over now to actually to Larry, who's going to be chairing this session. But thank you very much for coming, and I will see you throughout the day.
All right, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I know, come on, try and be a bit more cheerful. Good morning. Oh, thank you. My name is Larry Madowo. I come from Nairobi. I work for a TV station in Nairobi called NTV, and it's great to be here for Africa Utopia. And it's great that we're discussing Africa Rising. I live in Africa, and I hear this narrative all the time, mostly from multinationals, from politicians, from all sorts of other people saying this or the other. And maybe sometimes it feels like there's so much hype and not enough reality, especially if you think about the actual deliverables on the ground. Are people being lifted out of poverty? Do they have choices? Do they have proper leadership? Do they have all of these different things which people here in the Western world might take for granted? And it's great to have such a distinguished panel to talk about this. And what I'm going to do, I'll just do an introduction of who they are, and then as they make their opening statements in about 3 or 4 minutes, they will first of all talk about a little about what you do, and then your general sense on Africa Rising, hyper reality. And I'll start from the far left. We've got Pauline. I need to make sure I can pronounce your name right. Pauline Greaves is Head of Education at the Commonwealth Secretariat. Thank you so much for being here. Come on, give her a round of applause. This is to trick the audience into supporting you before you start, so they can't not clap afterwards. Also with us is the author Gillian Slovo. Please give her another round of applause. Also here, Rolake Akinkugbe. Am I saying that right? I nailed it. She's VP and Head of Energy and Natural Resources at FBN Capital. On my right, we've got Nachilala Nkombo, Deputy Executive Director of One. Round of applause, please. And last but not least, Mariéme Jamme, founder of Africa Gathering. So you will get to speak last, so I'm going to start again with Pauline and just give us a general sense of Africa Rising hyper-reality and what exactly you do in a bit more detail.
What exactly I do? As I'm the head of education with the Commonwealth Secretariat, so I work with 54 ministers of education, of which in Africa we deal with about 13 countries. My job really is trying to make sure that the reality is actually that they're delivering on what they've committed to do. Is it hyper-reality? I think it's both. I think it depends on which side of the coin you're looking at. In terms of the economically, the countries, many of the countries are doing really well. But in terms of the social development side, which is what I would look at, it's not doing as well. We have issues around education, around health, gender. Many of the countries have signed up for the Millennium Development Goals.
Right.
And in terms of education in Africa, we had the first decade, we had the second decade, and many countries are still not delivered on those. There are issues around access. There are issues around equity. There are issues around engagement or lack of engagement with an incredibly fast-growing youth and young population that are outside of the system and are not engaged. There are issues around governance, issues around quality education, period. And so 20 years on, we still have an issue where most countries have not achieved what was set out. We have incredible illiteracy rate. And we know for a fact that for every mother who's illiterate, we're looking at 3 generations for it to get back on track. Okay. So there are many, many issues, not only with the acceptance or delivering of the development agenda, but also the way countries have chosen to go about it. No one in this room would actually go to a doctor that's not qualified, yet we think it's okay to send our children to schools with unqualified teachers. And until we're able to get some of those things in line, we're not going to deal with the lack of education, kids that are leaving school that are not able to have basic skills and function. Okay. And so the reality is we're not delivering.
In all fairness, the reality also needs to be tempered with the countries that do well in certain of those, like for instance Rwanda with the universal healthcare, availing that to almost everyone, and other countries that are much further down in scale.
Agree. But in the case of Rwanda, overnight Rwanda changed their education system and the language of instruction, but they kind of forgot that teachers have to deliver. And if you're not able to deliver in the language or the primary language of the students in front of you, right, there's a problem. And so on one hand, there are no countries where everything is at the bottom. Okay. They're clearly staggered. So some have made incredible gains in terms of health, and some are struggling. The biggest problem is in sub-Saharan Africa, where we still have a large, we're not just talking about thousands, we're talking about millions of kids that are not in school, and okay, most of them are girls.
Excellent. Gillian.
Well, I'm going to start with what I do, which is I'm a novelist, and so I'm going to tell a story about something that happened to me in South Africa, which is in 2003, I went to Mandela's 85th birthday, which was held in Johannesburg in the Sandton Conference Centre, and I don't know if anybody knows Johannesburg or Sandton, but it's a mixture of bad taste glitz and office block. And
the richest square block in Africa.
Sorry?
Sandton, the richest square block in Africa. The richest square meter, rather.
Yeah. So there we were in this huge thing with about, I don't know how many people were seated to eat. The event was sponsored by Coca-Cola, and the most shocking bit of the evening was there's a very famous picture of Nelson Mandela burning his pass as a young man. And they put that picture up amongst others with him on the ground burning his pass, but instead of burning his pass, there was a bottle of Coke in his hand. And I looked around. This is the new South Africa. This is the South Africa rising in a way. And I looked around at the table that I was sharing, and there was quite a number of people at the table. And it really told me about the new South Africa who was at the table. to my right was this wonderful man, Zaki Ahmed, who was the founder of the Treatment Action Campaign. Remember, 2003, Mandela was no longer president, and Mbeki was, and he was in AIDS denial. And Zaki Ahmed started a grassroots movement to try and get antiretrovirals, the state to provide them to people. So there was the combination of the new and the old South Africa, an activist who was using grassroots to try and change society. Opposite us were three couples, two youngish black couples and one middle-aged white couple. So I asked them all, what do you do? What are you doing here? The middle-aged white couple were there because she was the dresser for the director of Coca-Cola Corporation. So this was her reward for coming. The two black couples, one of them was there because he was South African Telecom, i.e. the beginning of the new middle class, the new rich in South Africa. And the other couple who were there because he was one of Walter Sisulu's grandchildren. So there in that table, you had this mixture of the old and the new. And what struck me particular, I mean, Mbeki came into power in South Africa, and one of the things he was very determined to do was to create a black middle class. And in many ways, he succeeded in doing that. The problem was the majority of people in that country are not middle class, they're not properly educated, they don't have access, therefore, to jobs, and they don't have money. They're completely impoverished. So when I sit and look at this new South Africa and think, is it rising or not, I think, is it better than the past? Yes, absolutely yes, because justice and equality and democracy are very important. But, and has there been an expansion of the black middle class? Yes. And I think the result is that you now have an unequal society based not on race, but on class and on money. And in a way, unless that can be changed in the future, I cannot see how this country would be anything but troubled, as it really is at the moment.
Okay. Rolake, I mean, you look at the natural resources field very extensively in Africa. From where you stand, is Africa rising?
Well, it's a difficult question because Africa's rising, but for who? I personally think I've got two things going against me on this panel today. First of all, I'm a banker. Secondly, I work in natural resources, and we know that story in Africa. Just as a personal example, I moved back to Lagos after 17 years in the UK and traveling all over the world in May, 3 years. I often tell people I woke up and a light bulb came on in my head one day, and I just thought I would pack my bags and go. As part of that brain gain for Africa. But in terms of natural resources and the oil and gas sector, the truth is around 60 to 70% of Africa's exports are still from raw commodities. So in terms of Africa rising narrative, Africa isn't really in a different place to where it was 2 decades ago, where natural resources are concerned. The juxtaposition is that from a consumer point of view, in around 10 years' time, the continent is going to need to find around 10 to 20 million new barrels of oil to continue to consume the amount the continent consumes today. So there's a growing consumer class whose energy demands are increasing. There's continued push by African governments and international organizations and financial institutions to move away from the raw export of big difference. To move away from the raw export of commodities. So there's clearly a mismatch there. Secondly, I work in an institution, financial services, which are often lambasted for their lack of contribution to the bottom of the pyramid, the ordinary man on the street. But I certainly firmly see my role as helping to build capacity. Africa cannot bridge that gap except there's money and there's capital. In terms of the reality and the hype, we often talk about this, we've talked about this, the perception gap needs to be bridged. That is a major hurdle. The good stories about Africa are not often being told on the international stage. They're filtering through, but we still have a very, very long way to go.
All right. Thank you so much, Rolake. And Nachilala, your perspective, Africa Rising, hyper-reality.
Great stuff. My name is Nachilala Nkombo. I work for a campaigning organization called One. And basically what we do is that we mobilize communities globally and also in Africa to hold governments accountable to development commitments they make, whether it's to do with food security and agriculture, whether it's got to do with education, whether it's got to do with transparency and governance. And I think indeed, in terms of the African Rising narrative, it's already been said that it's not an even picture. It's not an even picture. There's aspects of it when you look at certain countries and certain sectors where Africa has done well. We know about countries like Ethiopia and Rwanda that have made the right investments that have actually translated into some social development outcomes. But on the whole, we have a number of countries really that have impressive growth rates, but when it comes to what matters to the people in terms of really inclusive growth, you find that a huge section of the population is left out of the economic mainstream. And for us, it points to some policy deficits. Yeah? Policymakers are not doing enough to take advantage of the positive overall macroeconomic environment. Because if you have growth, then you have a basis in some sectors, then you have a basis to collect taxes for you to be able to do the redistribution that actually needs to happen. And so one of the programs we've worked on has been to campaign for African governments to actually keep their commitments they made in 2003 to invest more money into the agriculture sector, because as we know, agriculture is a sector where the bulk of the African population actually depend on. And with agriculture offering 60% of the jobs in Africa, any transformation, any Africa Rising narrative that is going to rise together with the population has to happen in agriculture. So we've really been advocating and saying to the African governments that, look, you made a commitment in 2003 to spend so much money, 10% of your budget in the agriculture sector. And only 8 countries had actually fulfilled that. And of those 8 countries, you could see some of the tremendous progress that they had actually made. Currently, Africa actually spends a lot more than what they had actually committed in terms of importing food. So I think for Africa really to grab this opportunity, we're at a time when money, $1 or £1 is dropped in Africa, the rate of return on investment is much higher than if it's dropped in London. And there's something that policymakers need to do about that in terms of really taking advantage of that and making sure that those gains and benefits come back to the rest of the population.
Is part of the problem the fact that most of agriculture in Africa tends to be purely for subsistence? You plant enough to feed yourself and not much, or you're not doing it on a scale big enough to be commercially viable?
Well, our experience doing this work, because we had to work with a lot of farmer organizations and groups, farmers are smart entrepreneurs, right? They will produce volume if there's a market.
All right.
One of the key challenges that they do face is that they don't have access to reliable markets. And so one of the key intervention areas is the government making sure that they have the extension service for them to be able to understand what the supermarkets want, what regional markets are actually available. So yes, they produce a subsistence, because if they produce in excess, the product will go to waste. And also what we find is that African women are playing a very significant role in terms of food production, right? They feed nations and households in terms of the majority of the food that's produced. They're actually leading the way in terms of, I just needed to mention this, was agriculture is at a point where there's need for more value to be created. There's need for agriculture to be transformed in terms of food processing. And again, African women, they are leading the charge, and they lack recognition from policymakers.
All right. Mariéme, you shuttled back between London and all over Africa, and you struggle with visas and flights and access and all of these things. Do you think Africa is rising?
I think I like what Mrs. Greaves said earlier about education. For somebody who didn't have an education until 16 years old as a child is very crucial to me. But what is really interesting is, I'm going to go to another angle. I don't think Africa is rising. I think Africa is progressing. But there is a big problem right now. I look into the African talent pool. And that Africa talent pool has risen quite a lot. We have so many amazing people. I mean, the people I meet, I just said, wow, where do they come from? We have these amazing Africans, amazing leaders, amazing Africans who have got their PhDs, their masters. But we're not using them. We're not using those people. And some of them are afraid, actually, of going back home. You know, you got very, very courageous ladies like Rolake who could go back home, but, you know, but we don't have the right systems in place. So Africa cannot rise if we don't use this talent pool. This, you know, I feel sometimes so sad that, you know, it's so wasted. You know, you get this generation of people, you know, my generation and the generation before, you know, who are not serving Africa at all. And, you know, some of them are just sitting down or doing small businesses and nothing is happening. So for me, you know, I'm more into the human side. You know, Africa will not rise if we don't tap into this talent pool of leaders, of women, amazing guys out there. And that's why the Africa Gardening Platform was created, to feature these people somehow, and we can see the talent we have in the continent.
All right. I want to open this up to the audience, but I was just going to give you a story. I was having a chat with somebody, a friend from Nairobi who works for the BBC here, and we were talking about the property market in the continent, and he was giving an example of Nairobi. He comes back, and you drive and you see all of these huge apartments coming up, and a price of, let's say, 30 million shillings. In pounds, that's about 200,000 for a 3-bedroom apartment. It's like, who's buying that in Nairobi? Who's buying that anywhere in the continent? And you keep saying Africa is rising, and everybody remembers the economists and about Africa from the dark continent to what they said more recently. It's like, for most people, that's still beyond their reach. And that's maybe a good example of, in Kenya, for instance, a country of 40 million people, there are about 15 to 20,000 mortgages only. Bankers, you're not contributing to the bottom of the pyramid.
I did say I had several things going against me on the panel, but I like to call myself a tree hugger banker. It's interesting because we've often seen a lot of these statistics about the African middle class, and sort of returning to Nigeria after so many years abroad, I often wonder whether I'm just going to be one more addition to that middle class, and what essentially it means to be middle class in Africa. How does a state work for me? What is my purchasing power vis-a-vis what is available in the system? Classic example, I got to Nigeria in May, and as part of the package of returning back, you know, I was put up in temporary accommodation until I could find a place. And if anyone knows anything about Lagos, real estate, it's one of the most expensive real estate locations in the entire global south. And I spent 3 months looking for accommodation, and this is an African who considers herself middle class, but actually a lot of the properties were out of reach in pricing in some of the decent areas, and not necessarily the highbrow areas, also being priced in dollars. I mean, what does that say about the economy? So it took me 3 months to actually find a place that was economically reasonable, even for a banker going back to work in Africa. So I often question whether the hype around Africa's middle class, some people would define it as those who have at least $20 a day to spend. Now, in many African metropolises, how much can $20 really get you? So I think I wouldn't say that Africa is necessarily rising. I think Africa is changing. And whether the 90% are being carried along with that change, I think it remains to be seen. Now, from the financial perspective, sort of moving away from the perception of big corporation, one of the things that's increasingly being talked about is financial inclusion. One of the things that I think speaks to the Africa is changing narrative is the fact that a lot more banks, certainly in my sector, are looking at targeting, you know, the bottom of the pyramid. So over and beyond trying to get those in rural, semi-urban areas to access mainstream banking facilities, we're now seeing new types of technologies and synergies between mobile phone companies and financial institutions. You know, in your country, M-Pesa is one of the pioneers, probably one of the pioneers of that type of technology globally, actually, Kenya. So we're seeing a desire to reach out to those on the fringes of society. But as we know, it's not a heterogeneous continent, and progress has been patchy. And I think, as you mentioned, there will need to be certain types of policy decisions taken to ensure that we bridge that gap.
All right, you know the interesting thing about every Africa Rising story you will see, especially in the Western media, we'll always talk about that middle class you talked about, and they're hanging out at malls and going to watch movies and what of this. It's sort of the same template. You can pull out certain things, Nairobi or Lagos or Johannesburg, and it's the same story every single time. I want to go back around the panel again and go back from where we started. is Africa rising a hyper-reality, and just your general summary comments and why you believe it is rising or not, and how to solve that. This time I'll start with Mariéme.
Thanks, Larry. What I just said earlier is that, you know, I still believe in that. I still believe that, you know, Africa, for me personally, will not rise if, you know, all this talent I see, all this the amazing human capital of Africa is not being tapped into, is not being, you know, even touched to, you know, for me, Africa will not rise if we don't, you know, highlight and engage these people, because, you know, we've spent so much money in the education of the current generation and the generation before. So not tapping into these people qualities and how they can change, because I believe that the only people that can change Africa is Africans. And this is not just like a rhetoric or talking about it. It's actually we need to find some new African doers who are doing things in the continent and then based on fact and evidence. And that's the only way Africa will rise, as far as I'm concerned, in the next 10 years.
I like that. The only people that can change Africa are Africans.
Right.
More doers, less talkers.
Okay, Africa is changing, Africa is rising, but not for enough people. And I think it's clear what needs to be done. We need to make sure that there are proactive policies that actually promote sectors such as agriculture, because agriculture is the basis of any economic transformation, and if we're not transforming agriculture, if we're not developing the value chain in agriculture, then we're saying we're failing to leverage the other good things that are happening in other sectors. So yes, telecommunications is doing well, yes, the banking sector is doing well, mining, oil and gas is doing well, but we need to translate those gains to support other sectors that can help lift the rest of Africa out of poverty. And a key part of that is to make sure that we have this skills revolution, you know, the skill set that are needed to actually drive the economy, a more modern economy, not a traditional economy, which is still what the majority of Africa is.
All right. Rolake.
I think Africa is rising, but for the 1%. And I think the 90% need to be carried along. 99, sorry.
I agree. I think a number of things, and one of the things I think is that I've learned a tremendous amount from my fellow panelists here. And I do think you know, that the problem is, for me, Africa isn't one country anyway. And, you know, some parts of it may be rising, most parts of it are not rising.
So the two of you agree Africa is rising for the 99th percentile and not for the others. It's a tragedy. And finally?
I think economic development must be aligned to policies which focus on priority areas such as building sustainable economy through the development of human capital, and that the development must be focused on highly skilled and highly productive workforce. That Africa has changed, I think there's no dispute. I do agree that it's only for a very small percentage. I do have some concern that we talk about Africa as if it is one country, and it is so varied. And you have pockets that are doing really well, but consistently across the board, there are major issues. How well it will continue to do and how durable the change in some of these countries. Absolutely, education is the link to skills and economic growth. And if you don't have that, then the change we keep going backwards and forwards, 2 steps back and 1 step forward.
Absolutely.
All right. If most of the panelists agree there needs to be more talkers and doers, Africa rising for only the 1%, why do we keep saying Africa is rising? And maybe that's a question back to the audience. As you'll take with you and hopefully keep that conversation going. Thank you so much to Pauline, Gillian, Rolake, Nachilala, and Mariéme. Please give them a big round of applause.